Fantastic. Yes, thank you so much, Dave, for that introduction and also for organizing this. I was really, really thrilled to get your email inviting me to talk to your organization. Um, and to everyone attending, thank you for being here. Thank you for giving me your time. It's a real honor and pleasure to do this event. And especially as soon as I hear that I've caused you all to do a time change. So thank you for being so flexible with me. So I'm going to talk for 30 to 40 minutes, I think. After which, if there's time for questions, if that's the format of things, I'm happy to do that. Please let me know if my audio stops working, or if I drop out of signal. Just bear with me while I reconnect. But fingers crossed it all goes smoothly. On April the 22nd, 1865, Mexico's minister to the United States, Matias Romero, called upon Andrew Johnson at the White House. In addition to formally introducing himself to the newly inaugurated president, Romero had come to discuss something that was troubling him. The Mexican government had just informed Romero that since General Lee's surrender earlier that month, hundreds of Confederate soldiers, including a good many officers, had crossed the border into Mexico. These were not transient veterans wandering directionless across the continent. Rather, Minister Romero believed that these erstwhile rebels were flowing directly into the arms of the Mexican Empire. Now, you will notice that I just mentioned two governments existing in Mexico. Let me explain that. In 1862, the French Emperor Louis Napoleon had begun an invasion of Mexico. By 1863, he had established a constitutional monarchy in that country and named it the Mexican Empire. And on the throne of the Mexican Empire, he placed the Austrian Archduke, the gentleman we see standing there, Austrian Archduke Maximilian I. Meanwhile, Mexico's Republican government, headed by this gentleman here, President Benito Juarez, had been kicked out of Mexico City and was a government in exile, coordinating a military resistance to the Mexican Empire whilst on the run, moving from state to state, from city to city, to elude capture by the French imperial troops. So we have on the one side the Mexican Empire headed by Maximilian, backed up by the French Louis Napoleon's troops. And on the other side, we have the Mexican Republicans, also known as the Liberals or the Juarists. Minister Romero warned President Johnson that the ex-rebel migrants wished to lend their support to Maximilian's regime. In return, they apparently hoped that Maximilian would help them sustain a guerrilla war against the United States along the southern US border. So President Johnson listens to this. He's sympathetic to what Romero has to say. He understands the concern, but he's non-committal in terms of what his government's going to do about it. And that is because Johnson's major concern at this time is not so much the Confederates in Mexico as the French. He is very wary of provoking a conflict with France, possibly a full-blown war, at what is a very delicate time for the United States, just emerging from its own civil war. Johnson declines to commit himself, or rather his government, to taking any official action. However, he indicates to Romero, he says to Romero, his government will not obstruct any unofficial efforts that might happen to come from the United States to help the Juarists or otherwise stop the Confederates in Mexico. This is encouragement enough for Romero. Here's the thing, he's not the only one in Washington, D.C. at this time who's concerned about the Confederate migration. Another was the commanding general of the US Army, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant also believed that the Confederates in Mexico posed a national security threat to the United States. And as luck would have it, he was in DC at the same time as Romero. He was there to participate in Union Army celebrations. The two men met, they hit it off. They were aligned on this issue, so, they had a lot to talk about, a lot that they agreed on. but they actually got on personally very well together as well, and they would remain friends until Grant's death in the 1880s. So together, the two men over the coming weeks devised a plan. The plan was this: they would march a body of troops. They bandy about different numbers, but they land on around 50 to 60,000, they think will be about right. To march a body of troops down across the United States to the southern border, muster them out, and then have them cross the border into Mexico as private citizens, and then be absorbed into the Juarist army. Now, Johnson had warned Romero to keep his plan covert, but there was reason to believe that the American people would support this plan should it ever become public. And that's because at this time there was a huge amount of public goodwill, let's call it, in the United States towards the Mexican Republic. I just want to pause there and talk about my book more broadly. So the idea for it first came to me when I became aware of the scale of support in the United States for the Mexican Republicans fighting the French. Sympathy began when Napoleon first launched the invasion in 1862, and it built progressively year on year, at the same time as obviously the Civil War is unfolding. All of the major newspapers in the United States followed the conflict in Mexico closely. They often gave it front page news. They most certainly gave it generous article space. And almost every editor, major editor of a major newspaper, sooner or later declared themselves supportive of, on the side of the Mexican Republican cause. And they were very critical of Napoleon, Louis Napoleon, I should call him, not the original Napoleon. Not only newspapermen, politicians from both of the major political parties, for the most part, supported the Mexican Republicans. They gave speeches to that effect. They issued resolutions to Congress as well. So they took to the halls of Congress and delivered these speeches and had long discussions about the Mexican question. And patriotic organizations in the United States, if you've heard of the Union Leagues, which were formed ostensibly to promote the Union war effort, they actually dedicated a fair amount of their time to promoting the Mexican war cause as well. They organized public rallies, they commissioned pamphlets to be written about it. You can see one here, arguments in favor of the enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine. And they held quite extravagant banquets as well and invited the Mexican diplomatic corps to them, including Romero. This sympathy for Mexico continued after the Civil War had finished. What's notable after Appomattox is that the Union Army officers, several prominent ones, then come out also and make public statements about Mexico and put some pressure on the Johnson administration to do something to help the Juarists. So that's not just Grant, it's Nathaniel Banks, it's Schofield as well, Sheridan as well. And of course, not just the officers, but Union Army veterans, by their hundreds, if not thousands, go southwards of their own volition and sign up as volunteers in the Juarist Army after 1865. I won't spend too much time today talking about Mexican policy per se, about the decision making of first the Lincoln and then the Johnson administration about intervention, non-intervention in the Mexican conflict. It does feature in my book, and I'm very happy to talk about it in the question and answers if anyone would like to. What I instead want to talk about today is the nature of popular support for the Mexican cause, especially as it was expressed in the American press. Newspapers and to a lesser extent, pamphlets, speeches really make the backbone of the sources for my book. So it's very much a study of public discourse, of public conversations about Mexico and the Mexican question. On the pages of Union newspapers, the Union and Mexican causes became linked. I'll explain how in just a moment. And from that linking, there emerged a new language, a language of sister republicanism, continental fraternity, pan-American unity, this idea of allying with, being with the same as Mexico. And we can see some of the examples of this here, just some little snippets. Sister Republic became a very, very common phrase to refer to Mexico during this time. Our sister republic. Now, okay, so this struck me as extraordinary, only given what we know about the US-Mexican relationship in the 19th century more broadly, right? It's an incredibly fraught relationship. It's especially kind of between up to the 1870s. It's a relationship marked by conflict over territory, unpaid debts, smuggling, lawlessness on the border. Indeed, by the 1850s, Mexico had become so deeply ingrained in the minds of Americans as a chaotic place, an anarchic place, that it was commonly perceived as a failed republic. That was kind of the stereotype of Mexico at this time. And indeed, it wasn't just Mexico. Mexico had come to represent, I think, all of Spanish America, all or the Spanish American republics for mid-century Americans. And so ubiquitous were these images of failed Mexican republicanism that the image had become almost a counterpoint for US nationalism. Mexico's failings, and indeed the failings of all the Spanish American republics, which seemed to be forever roiling in wars and rebellions and revolutions, all of that was perhaps proof, Americans thought, that their republic, prosperous, stable, their republic was somehow blessed, unique, exceptional. So, given this, it led me to ask, how did Americans in the 1860s come to switch their view of Mexico so radically and so rapidly? And what did that process do to the logic of US exceptionalism? In searching for answers to that question, I made a few discoveries. Today, I want to talk about just two. I want to make 2 points, if I can. Point number one, the continental fraternity that I just mentioned, the sentiments of sympathy and alliedness with Mexico that suffused American society in the 1860s was, I want to argue, underpinned by deep insecurities among US Americans about their own republic. Number two, that these insecurities, widespread, popularly felt, had political power. They were manipulated by political leaders to move US Americans towards certain policies, and it's in particular towards certain different methods of reunion after Southern secession. Now, today I'm going to focus on how it was used by the advocates of radical Reconstruction, though the book examines others as well. Again, happy to discuss this in the Q&A. Now, my book goes from the secession crisis up to the early 1880s. Today, however, I'm going to try and make my argument by focusing only on a very short period, 1865 to 67. To my first point, soon after the start of the French invasion, the Union of Mexico, the Union press began making parallels with that conflict and the Confederate rebellion then ongoing. Slaveholders, French imperialists, Mexican monarchists, the Catholic priesthood, all of these, they said, were advocates of hierarchy, tradition, hereditary privilege. All were enemies of liberty and democracy. And many Union newspapers went so far as to claim that they were in league with one another, that there was no coincidence that Louis Napoleon had timed his invasion of Mexico to happen exactly 1 year after Southern secession, and whilst the Civil War was going on, that the Confederates and monarchists in Mexico were colluding with one another in various ways. As they saw their enemies aligned, the Union press also began to look at the Mexican Republic a little differently. So a few things I've noticed, they were much more ready to distinguish different groups in Mexico than they were before. So they distinguished conservatives from liberals in particular. They also began to revisit their old theories about why was political instability so prevalent in Mexico, or had been for so many decades. Before, in the 1850s, it had become fairly well accepted that there was some defect in the Mexican nation, some character flaw, some racial defect that meant that the population was unsuited to self-governance. But after 1862, that theory kind of goes out the window. And union newspapers began to talk a lot more about Mexico's historic issues with self-governance are due to the intrigues and machinations of the Mexican conservatives and the priests, of these particular Mexicans, not all Mexicans, these particular ones. Meanwhile, the liberals, the Mexican liberals who were then fighting, the French fighting the Mexican Empire, those are brave, heroic. The newspapers begin to celebrate their martial spirit, their patriotic devotion, and to talk about them as true Republicans, worthy allies. So on the one hand, the Mexican Republic has kind of been elevated in the esteem of the Union press. At the same time, however, these same newspapers begin to think more negatively about their own republic. 19th century Americans had been taught to believe that the United States existed outside the laws that governed other nations and governed other republics in particular. That the US alone was immune to domestic dislocations, civil wars, and domestic rebellions of the type that was so typical of other republics, ancient and modern. Southern secession in 1860-61 shattered this illusion. It was no longer tenable to claim that Providence had spared the United States alone from internal convulsions common in, say, Spanish America. Faced with that reality, the Union press began to make comparisons between their country and Spanish America, but particularly Mexico. Not favorable comparisons either. You can see some examples of the language that starts to be used. There's this particular phrase, Mexicanization, which is popularized during this time. We are being Mexicanized. We are becoming like Mexico. Underneath this language, I argue, is the notion that maybe the United States is not exceptional after all. Now, these concerns were not put to rest by the civil wars ending. Let's return to 1865. So, as we know, that's the year that the Civil War ended, but the French intervention in Mexico raged on for another 2 years. Intoxicated by the triumphalism following Appomattox, Union Army officers, public officials, and newspapermen called on their government to carry the fight against autocracy into Mexico. So there's this huge kind of burst in the weeks and months immediately following Appomattox, huge burst of popular enthusiasm for let's carry on the fight against these autocrats, against these conservatives into Mexico. What's also notable about that burst of enthusiasm is how short-lived it is. Quite rapidly, those calls fade away as 1865 progresses. And I would argue that the reason for that is that the triumphalism of the post-Appomattox weeks and months is eroded quite quickly, and a creeping sense of uncertainty begins to seep into the national mood as the question of Reconstruction looms larger. In the summer of 1865, Johnson was pushing ahead with his plan to readmit the rebel states. His terms for re-entry were minimal and aimed at facilitating a speedy reunion. Meanwhile, news came from the South that legislatures were enacting black codes, enacted to limit the freedom and rights of newly freed Black Americans, effectively replicating elements of the slave system. Interestingly, similar news was coming from Mexico at this time. Allow me to explain myself. So we already know that there were hundreds of ex-Confederates flocking to the country. Then, in September 1865, Maximilian issued a decree. That decree said that all Black immigrants who came from the United States into Mexico must be contracted to a patron for 5 years. Now, the Mexican Republic had outlawed slavery in 1837. But through this decree, Maximilian signaled to ex-Confederates that they could enter with what remained of their human property if they could get it there. As you might imagine, certain newspapers in the US were incensed. Let me give you some quotes here. The black-owned South Carolina Leader proclaimed in November 1865, quote, "Not satisfied with offending the United States by overthrowing the republicanism of Mexico, Maximilian has added to his impertinence slavery under the name of serfdom or peonage in an effort to persuade persons whom he calls emigrants to settle in the country." End quote. Connecticut newspaper, the Hartford Daily Courant, agreed, quote, "The difference between this patronage and undisguised slavery is too small to be appreciated," end quote. Meanwhile, the New York Tribune pointed out that Maximilian's slavery decree, quote, "did not essentially differ from the slave laws and new apprenticeship forms recently passed by the reformed Southern legislatures," end quote. The newspaper surmised from this that ex-Confederates in Mexico and those remaining in the United States were conspiring in a joint effort to, quote, "conserve all the despotism of slavery while rendering its legal aspect more plausible," end quote. What's going on here? These newspapers are noticing that there's parallel efforts going on here to resurrect, or they believe to resurrect slavery in some form, both in the US South and in Mexico. And what truly worries them is that these efforts are not just in parallel, that they're in collusion together, that they're in coordination, that they are fueling, inspiring, emboldening one another, that there's a mutual reinforcement going on here. They're also concerned that it looks like the ex-Confederates in Mexico are making moves to reform themselves into a slaveocracy, right? To amass power, to amass wealth in Mexico. And a number of newspapers expressed the concern that if they allow this to happen, that slaveocracy, that transplanted slaveocracy, we might say, will come to dominate the government in Mexico and eventually orchestrate a conflict between the Mexican Empire and the United States. Now, this is a chilling thought, given the worrying and doubtful condition of white Southern loyalty to the United States at this time. Newspapers across the North quoted the congressional hearings on Reconstruction, which took place in early 1866, and particularly the Army officers who reported on the state of Southern loyalty at that time. Here's a quote that did the rounds from Major General George Henry Thomas about ex-rebel leaders in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Quote, "They anticipated that in case the government should become involved in foreign war, they would watch their opportunities to strike for independence of the states lately in rebellion." General Benjamin Grierson predicted that, quote, "In such an event, the enemies of the government throughout the South would declare their support for the Mexican Empire, rise up in insurrection against the United States, and attempt again its destruction." April 1865 had marked the formal end of war between the North and South. Viewed from a continental perspective, however, it was clear that the wider battle between autocracy and republicanism in North America raged on, and that the United States was still vulnerable to the machinations of the slavocratic monarchical conspiracy from both within and just beyond its borders. The situation in Mexico, in short, made it painfully apparent that the post-war United States remained weak, divided, and very far from possessing its previously commanding position on the continent. So what I hope I've managed to achieve there is just give you some sense of what I mean by this crisis of exceptionalism, by this self-doubting that's going on in the United States at this time. And that it began with Southern secession, but it continued after the Civil War as well. Now, to my second point, which is this had political uses. As we know, there were midterm elections in the United States between September 1866 and April 67, which resulted in Republicans taking control of both houses of Congress, with majorities large enough to overrule a presidential veto. The new Congress immediately began overturning Johnson's lenient Reconstruction and enacting a root and branch transformation of the South's political and social order. A few examples. The first Reconstruction Act of March 1867 divided the former rebel states into 5 districts and placed each one under martial law. Later that month, the Second Reconstruction Act put US troops in charge of registering voters and overseeing elections in the Southern Territories. And finally, Congress announced that in order to be readmitted into the Union, former rebel states must redraft their state constitutions to include ratification of the 14th Amendment. Republican-aligned newspapers looked for ways to sell this raft of radical legislation to a public we should always remember that was not necessarily so radical as the Republicans in Congress were. The situation in Mexico offered them one way to do this. Let me explain that. First, and as I've kind of already alluded to, the continued presence of the Mexican Empire, coupled with the continued presence of Confederates in that empire, was continually kind of returned to by the Republican press. It was talked about a lot. And I think I would argue as a reminder, because it was a useful reminder for them to trot this out before the public, because it made the case that the slave power is still very much alive. It has international allies. There are movements going on our borders and within our borders. This is very much still a very present and virile danger enemy that we're facing here, and we need to step up our policies to address it. So there's the kind of threat there. On the other hand, there's also the promise. If that's the stick, there's also the carrot, which is they simultaneously use the Mexican situation to describe what would happen, not just to the United States, but to the continent if they successfully enacted radical reconstruction. Basically, that radical reconstruction will have continental effects. So, how did they make that argument? In the months immediately following Appomattox, Mexican liberal forces mounted a kind of a surge against Maximilian's troops. And it was hugely successful. They managed to strengthen their hold over many northern states, including Sinaloa and Chihuahua, and occupy almost every significant town along the Rio Grande. So there's a huge kind of Mexican liberal string of victories that follow in the wake of Appomattox. And interestingly, US newspapers are very quick to credit the United States for this, not the Juarists. New York Herald's Mexico City correspondent, for example, says this, quote, "The news of the Union Army's triumph afforded vast encouragement to the adherents of President Juarez. New spirits have been infused into the Republican armies south of the border, and nearly the whole of northern Mexico is now under the authority of Juarez," end quote. Before long, however, this Juarist surge faltered. Maximilian's troops mounted a counter-assault that was very successful, and by the end of 1865, saw Maximilian's troops in control of almost every key northern city, including Chihuahua and Matamoros, which is very important. Once again, US newspapers explained this by pointing to their own nation. The Chicago Tribune, for example, insisted that the Juarists' recent losses were due to, quote, "the distracted condition into which our domestic politics are again thrown by President Johnson's proceedings." The newspaper went on to make the argument that Maximilian and his followers had been shaken by Confederate surrender. They had been appalled to see that such a valuable ally fall. However, the defiance that ex-Confederates had shown since then, their success in clawing back some of their power under presidential reconstruction, had apparently inspired Maximilian and his supporters with fresh hope that the conservative cause on the continent was not lost. The Hartford Daily Courant agreed, and it added that based on this logic, that therefore a thoroughgoing program of reconstruction was necessary because it would expunge the final die-hard rebels from political power in the South. It would finally stabilize the United States' government institutions in doing so. And that this would then rejuvenate the United States' they used the phrase moral force. rejuvenate the United States' moral force in the minds of Mexican liberals, emboldening them to then press ahead with their war effort. So, what are they arguing here? They're not arguing these newspapers for the United States to intervene in the Mexican conflict. They're actually saying that that's no longer necessary. All that's necessary is for the United States to focus on its own domestic politics, to fully rid the nation of the old slave power through radical reconstruction, and that in doing that, the political and governing systems of the country will be perfected, rejuvenated. The moral force of the exceptional republic will come surging back out again, radiate across the continent, and inspire the Mexican liberals in their own war effort. So they're putting a lot of stake, a lot of stock, probably I should say, in this idea of the symbolic moral force of the US Republic. They really believe that it has power. Harper's new monthly magazine said that this process will play out beyond Mexico. Congressional reconstruction, it argued, would restore the United States its vital power as the world's standard bearer of self-governance, enabling US Americans to act on foreign nations by our example of freedom and prosperity rather than meddlesome intervention. Awed by the United States' success in recovering from its civil war, neighboring countries would seek to imitate its political institutions and open up their economies to US technologies, products, capital. In short, radical reconstruction would enable the United States to, quote, dominate the continent by the force of its own prosperity and intelligence, its liberty and order. So there's a kind of continental, uneven hemispheric future that opens up thanks to congressional reconstruction. By utilizing a continental framework, or rather utilizing a continental framework, enabled the early advocates of congressional reconstruction to link their plans for the South to the fate of North America more broadly. Radical reconstruction, they said, would return the United States to its original role as the most successful of the New World republics, ushering in a period of US hegemony marked by liberalism, democracy, and liberty for everyone on the continent. Should they fail to push on with radical reconstruction, however, then the forces of aristocracy and hierarchy, still present in North America despite the fall of the Confederacy, would wage a counter-assault, swallowing up the continent, not just the nation, the continent, in darkness. Okay, so I'll just finish here with a few final thoughts. We are guilty, I think, of sometimes giving the US Civil War a special place in our minds. Other countries' civil wars are destructive, they're ruinous. The United States' was regenerative. It was a watershed that the nation had to pass through in order to reach the next stage of its evolution. It was a rite of passage, as it were, a stepping stone on its path to becoming a truly free, truly modern nation. It's a comforting narrative. It's a satisfying narrative. I don't know if all contemporaries who lived through the war would have recognized it, though. My research shows that many Americans, in fact, worried a great deal about their civil war and the effect that it would have on their nation long term. This concern, I think, it can be seen when we look at their perceptions of Mexico during the Civil War era. Before 1860, that country had been a foil, a counterpoint. Its failings proved the successes of the United States. But the Civil War broke down that wall. Comparisons with Mexico now revealed similarities, not differences, and so gave the rise of the language of Mexicanization. Underpinning this language was the fear that the United States was doomed to join Mexico on the list of failed New World republics, that their civil war was not exceptional, and perhaps nor was their republic. My book charts this insecurity from its first appearance in the Secession Crisis up to the early 1880s, when analogies with Mexico and talk of Mexicanization kind of faded from widespread use. Digging into the language, I think, reveals an interesting duality at its heart. On the one hand, the idea that the United States and Mexico, in fact, shared common experiences, common trials and tribulations, I think was humbling for US Americans and inspired sympathy and affection among them for their Southern neighbors. And by Southern neighbors, I mean Mexicans, not Confederates. Hence the rather remarkable burst of Pan American unity, which infused US society for much of the 1860s. At the same time, though, the language of Mexicanization, which emerged alongside this, revealed how uncomfortable US Americans were with the parallels they could see stretching across the Rio Grande. Mexicanization was to them a blight, a sickness, something to be cured. In this way, the continental framing had political power. Those wishing to sell a particular policy prescription could frame it as the way to save the United States from Mexicanization. This framing could appeal to Americans' pride and ambition on the one hand, and to their insecurities and fears on the other. Political leaders sold a range of policies for reunion to US Americans on this very basis, promising that their particular road out of civil war guaranteed the stabilization of US institutions and therefore the country's return to hemispheric glory. And each warned that failure to follow their policy would lead not just to national, but continental and perhaps even hemispheric disaster. The crisis of exceptionalism in this way generated its own power in Civil War era politics, a mindset we ought to appreciate if we wish to fully understand how Americans navigated a path from disunion to reunion. Thank you very much.